Hello, hello, and welcome to another engaging episode of Stan the History Man. And I'm your host, Dr. Stanley Sandler. Today, I wanted to talk about English food. Yeah, getting adjusted here. I was in England in the early 1950s, and the reason I want to talk about that time, not just the fact that I was there and eating it, but England then was pretty much a purely English than it was either before the war or in the 1920s or 30s. Uh, because this is after the war, England had gone through a period of, well, first of all, the Depression, then the war, and then austerity, which the idea of austerity was to pretty much keep uh, people living as simply as they could, because England was in debt from the war, understandably, and so much of its industry, its industrial output, was for export only. I don't think I ever saw a modern English car when I was in England at the time. But getting back to food, England's got a bad reputation for food. I say, oh, English food. They boil the tar out of everything. And there's a lot of truth in that. I mean, think of how many English restaurants you know, okay? Now, there's one thing you do know, and of course, we always associate that with English food is fish and chips. And that is I remember first vividly fish and chips over there, which I hardly knew what it was before I got to England. And of course, I was just a kid then. And they had these little fish and chip shops. I mean, we lived near an area with a working class area where there's a whole bunch of row houses. You take one step out the door and you're on the sidewalk. And yet, one or two of those places were actually converted to fish and chip stores. And that was the real fish and chips. I mean, it was cooked in artery clogging animal fat. It was wrapped in newspaper, none of this wax paper or anything like that, or plastic containers. And it was such a way they did it, like the covering didn't really seem to touch the fish itself, which, by the way, was cod. And I've never had anything better. All the fancy fish and chip restaurants here in the States know those little storefront fish and chip places in England as the best fish and chips I ever had. Now, of course, English food is a lot more than fish and chips. Um, they're the good, the bad, everywhere else. Uh, One of the things that my folks and I, we tried it. We had access to the commissary then, but we tried English food and actually lived on what they call on the economy. We didn't live on a base. And the one of the things we tried was bachelor's dried peas. So I will try it. And the dried peas, it had a sprig of mint in it, and sort of a green dye. And you'd sit there and watch the dye from your peas rushing it, going into your mashed potatoes. So that was one thing we tried once, and that was the end of it. Another odd thing in English food was toast. Now Americans like hot buttered toast. No, the English toast their bread, and then they put it on a toast rack for it to cool off. What's the purpose of that? Uh, well, things like more exotic English food, like blood pudding and steak and kidney pie, we passed that up as well. Uh, Another thing I should mention was English bread. Now, during the war, they had what they called the national loaf, which all the English hated. But I'm sure nutritionists would say today that it's very good because it had all kinds of vegetables added, beans and oatmeal, that type of thing to stretch it out and not use as much wheat. And I'm sure it was probably more healthy than the white bread that they had and we had at the time. The horrible white bread. I mean, it's just all the goodness is refined out of it, and they add some chemical vitamins to replace for what they removed from it. Uh, but now the English food that we did like, of course, ate steak and fish and chips, and also English drink. Soft drinks. I was a kid, of course. I wasn't aware of English. I couldn't compare English liquor to ours. But they had what they called sweet shops, and that was just all it was sweets. I mean, our candy stores, nothing like that, because our candy stores would sell milk and lunch meat and bread, maybe. They sold just sweets. And boy, they had good sweets. If you ever have some of the English Callard and Bowser and Roundtrees and all, it's really very good stuff. The English do have a sweet tooth, and that showed it in there. And I should also mention, this kind of shows the decency of the English, was that although we were Yanks and living well above the level of most English at the time, that we had ration points. They issued us ration points, which we didn't usually, or give it to friends, something like that, which we weren't supposed to do. But basically, they actually looked at, what about those Yanks? Got to make sure that they're well fed. So the English drink, non-alcoholic drink, I really probably a ginger beer was my favorite. Now, English ginger beer is not like the ginger beer you get in this country, which is called Jamaican ginger beer, because English ginger beer had a head on it, just like beer. Now, it was not alcoholic, but it was really, it was like super ginger ale. They told me that before we'd gotten there, they used to have it in stone crocks. Well, I never saw that, but I mean, the stuff that came in bottles was pretty darn good also. And I like the effervescence of it as well. Lots of fizz in English ginger beer. Paired racks, which I'm sure you've never heard of, and I never did either before I got to England. It was explosive carbonation. It took the cap off and it went shooting out like champagne or something. I'd sure love to get some of that. Well, English ginger beer and English paired racks, for that matter. So there were things that English. That we liked. Another thing that we liked, even though the English didn't like it that much, was Hovis. That was a lot of uh, different kinds of grain in it. It was kind of descended, I think, from the English national health, the national loaf that the English all hated during the war. But we thought it was pretty good. And I'm sure nutritionists would certainly praise Hovis with all of its dark grains and so on. And I should also mention that at this time, there were no supermarkets. I mean, we're talking 1950, 1951, 1952, when we were over there. No supermarkets. It was all shops. There was the greengrocer, where you got vegetables. There was the fishmonger, you got fish fry. There was the ironmonger, for example, a lot of people heated with kerosene. They called it paraffin. You had to get that from the ironmonger. And all these little shops lined up on the high street. And that was sort of the center of the English shopping. The English housewife every day would take a string bag, maybe not on Sunday, I don't know, take a string bag and go to the fishmonger, the ironmonger, the butcher, every day. And I remember doing that, and just feeling this string bag, cutting into your fingers, because like kind of a long walk. I mean, not by American standards maybe, but still, of course, they had sidewalks in those days that you could walk on in England. I guess they still have sidewalks, something we've lost to a large extent. But it was completely different. And of course, it was the high street, what we call Main Street or whatever is the high street, and that's where they do their shopping. It's interesting how the English do have a bad reputation for cooking. They just boil everything. Well, when tea first came to England, the English housewives boiled the tar out of the tea, poured off the water, and ate the tea leaves, and probably didn't think they're very good. So it took a while to say, no, you eat the water and drink the water, and not eat the tea leaves. And that's where the old English thing about tea comes from. There is almost like a tea ritual in England. Like in those days, probably it's changed dramatically, I know. But American troops in North Africa, and I guess in Europe as well, during the war, noticed that almost in the middle of combat, not quite, but almost, they'd be brewing up. Maybe they were under shell fire and so on, and dug in the trenches. They'd brew up, as they said, for their tea. And of course, English tea must be very strong also. They say it should be strong enough that when you put a spoon in the center, the spoon won't fall over. Right? It's a slight exaggeration, but there's probably a lot of truth to that. And I wonder, shipping was everything in World War II. Everything hinged on shipping. And the Germans trying to stop the shipping, of course, with their U-boats, and enormous casualties. And yet, England doesn't grow tea. Those tea ships must have had to basically fight their way through in convoys and so on from India. I mean, where else would the English get their tea except from India, Ceylon, the Darjeeling area and I'm sure it was kind of as vital as munition was to keep the English supplied with their tea. And in that kind of cold, wet climate, a hot brew like tea is very good. Now the English drank coffee also, but just not obsessed with the way, almost obsessed with the way the Germans or the Americans are. So they're the good and the bad of English English cuisine, and as I say, it was so purely English that it was before I think England was more influenced by America before the war. I remember seeing a photograph of the coronation of the traffic during the coronation of George VI, Queen Elizabeth, the late Queen Elizabeth's father. And here's this American Chrysler airflow right in the middle of it. Now, I'm sure there weren't many airflows in England, but it was there. Nobody remarked upon it. But as I say, after the war, I did not see the only American cars I saw in England after the war were the cars of the Yanks. They called them chrome boats and jukeboxes on wheels, that type of thing, compared to English cars at the time. Say the English cars that they did build, and they ship over to the Yanks and the Canadians and whatever people survived in better shape from the war. So kind of just a slice of England. Now, I'm telling you how things have changed. When we got over there, of course, we were Americans. Pizza, have to have pizza. Which is interesting because we think of hot dogs and hamburgers. That's American. That's you can't get more American than that. But you ever hear people say, "Let's go out for hamburgers"? Or hot? No, say, "Let's go out for pizza." Well, in England, in London, this is London at the time when Mrs. Sandler and I were over there. This would be like 1963 to 1965, doing research work there, and we couldn't get pizza. And I thought, "Oh, I'd have pizza." So we looked. We just couldn't get the right cheese, a pepperoni cheese, or the I'm sorry, the pepperoni sausage, the mozzarella cheese. But finally, from a tip off, some English friend told Mrs. Sandler, "Well, you go to Soho, which is kind of the red light district of London. Soho, not entirely, but a section of Soho, and there she managed to get a reasonable facsimile of pizza and sausage, or not pizza, but the cheese and the sausage." And she brought it home, and I'm telling you, I never tasted a better pizza in my life. I mean, here I've been about a year without pizza. And so I say this is a capital city of the world, one of the biggest cities, one of the most sophisticated cities, the center of finance and trade and all. No pizza. I mean, not just you couldn't buy pizza, you couldn't buy the makings of pizza. So later on, a decade or so later, we had a friend of ours, an old English friend from those years. And I said, do you think maybe in the larger cities, London or Manchester, that maybe you could get pizza? And she replied, Domino's delivers. So that just shows how things have changed. Well, it's a brief discussion of English foods, maybe not one of the world's most important topics, but something gives you an idea of what England was like when England really was England. Well, thank you for listening and watching this program. This is Stan the History Man, and I look forward to talking with you again. Thank you.